Hey everyone, we'll be running a demo debate on the round 5 motion of USUDC, which is this house opposes the stigma against neediness. After that, we'll talk a bit more about our reasoning for our placement of the motion, as well as other case lines that you could run beyond those presented in the demo debate, and broader strategic notes about the motion. Bella, are you good? Great. Heartbreak is one thing, my ego's another. I'm begging you, please give this one to OG motherfucker. Three arguments, characterization will be integrated. Firstly, this stigma discourages healthy communication and relationships, and there are five broad burdens within this argument. Burden one, why is this stigma communicated in particularly harsh ways? Firstly, there's a selection effect. The set of people most comfortable saying neediness is cringe are also those who tend to be the most desired. They have less experience in asymmetric relationships. And because they haven't had those experiences, they're more likely to look down on others who are needy in relationships and tend to seek validation more commonly. That's part of why you see social media influencers saying that showing affection is the ick, for example. And secondly, to use even a favorable example for op, even when it's registered therapists on social media, they often pathologize neediness in overly broad and unnuanced ways, like the reason you want attention from them is because you have low self-esteem. But that makes the stigma harsh, because this means that the advice is overly generalized to situations of wanting attention, even when you may just want attention because you love your partner, and not per se because you have low self-esteem. And as a strategic note, for ops arguments to work, they have to concede that the stigma is pretty harsh, otherwise their impacts are relatively more limited. What does it mean in real terms for the stigma to be harsh? For one, it means that the way that people online define excessive attention seeking or excessive seeking of validation is in ways that are relatively uncharitable. Like, for example, it may just be considered excessive to double text someone to check in on them after they've had a difficult day. Step two, why does a harsh stigma hamper communication in relationships? Well, the stigma, because it's harsh, makes you scared of judgment from other individuals. You overcorrect. You don't say, I have feelings for you. Let's talk about the constant flirty interactions that we have, but rather you brush those interactions under the rug. You don't say, I need strong loyalty in a relationship because I have trust issues, because you're scared of the other person now judging you and viewing you as needy. And step three, this is obviously bad. Number one, it's bad early on in relationships. Realistically, the stigma against neediness has created a very significant amount of situationships. People being stuck in gray areas between friends with benefits and dating because they're too scared to talk about their concerns. And on top of that, even when you're in early dating stages, this still applies to you, right? You're just getting to know the other person, but the stigma makes you less likely to tell your partner what they want in those early stages of relationships. Why is that bad? At some point, you'll need to confront them about what you want in a relationship. Whoops, you have different family values than I do. Well, we've been talking for 6 months, and now it's way more emotionally devastating for us to have to break up because of that difference in family values. On our side, you're more likely to get preemptive communication about these issues and enter relationships with people with whom you are more compatible. So any issues in relationships that Up might talk about are less likely to materialize in the first place when people are more upfront about what they want. And I'll talk about this in more depth later in the argument. And more particularly, this preempts any op argument about codependence, because codependence will happen anyway. The honeymoon phase of falling in love with someone does not go away, and that'll still overpower the norm. But at least on our side of the house, you are codependent with someone who you are more compatible with, versus on their side, being codependent on someone with very different values than you do, and then feeling even more upset when it ends. But secondly, communication is also just important for happier relationships. You hear what the other person wants, whether it be sexual preferences in the bedroom, or expressing direct concerns you have in the relationship. In many cases, someone is doing something to upset you and they don't even know that they're doing it to upset you. Like, for example, trauma dumping. On our side of the house, you can resolve those issues more directly because you feel more emboldened to actually bring them up. Step four, without the stigma, you won't be too needy. You still don't want to overwhelm your partner. You empathize and care for them deeply. Now, Op might say people are selfish, so they'll be too needy without the stigma. Maybe people are selfish generically, but specifically in relationships, we have very strong evolutionary instincts to empathize with others because it makes for more productive mating and better compatibility for children. And therefore, that argument is implausible in debate land. This means communication is better on our side of the house and it's more preemptive. You communicate your concerns in a balanced and proactive way, but you won't be too overbearing. So, for example, you gradually tell your partner what your needs are. Secondly, this exacerbates power imbalances in relationships. The premise of this argument is clear. As I established in the prior claim, the stigma asymmetrically gets applied to people who are less attractive, for example. And on top of that, it's also more likely to apply to groups such as women. You're more likely to be seen as bitchy, for example, when you bring up concerns. And yes, sexist norms exist anyway, but the point is that the stigma, because it's so prevalent and because it's so harsh, compounds with those sexist norms in a very significant way and makes them grow stronger. This is horrible. Women, for example, have a harder time holding men accountable for sexism in the relationships. Why? Because now if they say something, they're being too needy. You can't say anymore, well, why are you shirking all these responsibilities onto me? That's too needy. Society tells them, be chill about it. Men will find you more hot and more attractive if you are chill about it, rather than directly raising your concerns. And obviously that has a terrible effect on women's mental health because it puts them in a terrible situation where they both feel bad about themselves and can't stop the fact that they're being mistreated. We fix this because yes, sexism exists anyway, but the problem is that the stigma against neediness is packaged on social media as being cool and the norm. So you gaslight yourself into thinking, oh, it's just because I'm needy. Whereas on our side of the house, when that stigma doesn't exist, but your partner is still dismissing your concerns, the reason isn't veiled behind that stigma. And therefore, you're more likely to realize that it is sexism in the first place and more likely to confront it. And it's easier for third parties, such as your friends, to be able to convince you that this is an actual issue. So yes, maybe sexism happens on both sides, but we course correct for it more commonly on our side of the house. And I also want to do some brief weighing against any possible opposition arguments about harassment. External penalties for harassment exist either way. There's social backlash, people talk, rumors spread, restraining orders exist in very extreme cases. So Ops' argument on harassment and power imbalances is less common than our argument about power imbalances and sexism. Finally, this is terrible for individuals' mental health in the dating market, and there are two broad groups who this stigma hurts. Group number one, people who follow the norm. Obviously, the stigma against neediness pushes people into a mold. Seem cagey, seem experienced, mysterious, avoid double texting, be non-committal. And when some people do this, there's also a game theoretic incentive for others to do the same because they also want to reap those social benefits. But this is bad for everyone in the dating market. It makes people feel like they're unlovable, but they can't talk to others about it. It puts stress on people because they have to do things like time their responses to text in order to seem not too needy. But obviously, we avoid these harms on our side of the house. People feel freer to be themselves and to show more affection. Everyone gets more love on the dating market. They feel attractive and valued for who they are rather than a mold that they are pushed into. But also, some people might not follow the norm. They like doing what they're not told to. They might be nonconformist. Those people also pretty trivially are hurt by the stigma. They're made fun of by other individuals around them for being too needy. So the endpoint is clear. Both sets of people are mentally better off on our side of the house and comfortable in their own bodies. Op may say that seeking validation makes you feel bad, but on our side, if you boost individual self-confidence, then you don't need to seek out that validation for bad reasons in the first place.
The premise of op case is very simple. Humans are often bad at regulating their individual emotions, especially in intimate relationships, and how much of that is transferred to their partners. Without the norm and without the stigma, people risk often becoming overly needy, and a stigma against neediness is absolutely important to create a space that is able to distinguish emotional reliance that's helpful and when it becomes harmful. Before I go on to forwarding two arguments, one, why excessive neediness is bad for relationship, and two, why this actually, and actually maybe a third argument, but the second one is about why this actually increases harassment, weighing the argument. And thirdly, why this actually makes valid emotional claims that opposition wants to talk about, opposition wants to talk about more visible. Before that, I just want to respond to Matt very quickly. First, we can probably concede that the stigma is likely to be very harsh, but is unlikely to be unreasonable and communicated badly for two reasons. One, let's talk about why it's likely to be reasonable. I want to note that affection is generally something that people like in relationship. So it's not the case that when your boyfriend texts you a second time, you immediately ascribe to that to neediness, even if a stigma exists, because there are very natural tendencies for people to like affection. It is nice that when your partner cares about you, it is nice that they're often giving you validation. These are often things that you want in a relationship before you even opt into one in the first place. So it's unlikely that you're going to overprescribe things to be needy in the first place. It is often when these things often make you so uncomfortable and so burdensome that you realize, because probably people have a rose-tinted glasses when it comes to affection that's shown to them because they probably like those things in relationship in the first place. So it's unlikely that this is overprescribed. But secondly, even if the stigma is relatively harsh in that you're going to point out actions that your partner does that often comes off as very needy, this is unlikely to be communicated badly. Number one, because insofar as you care about the person, things that are personal flaws are really hard to address, and you want to do this in a nice way. You don't want your partner to take this so personally that could potentially be relationship ending. You don't want your partner to think that this is something that they can never fix and therefore they don't want to be with you anymore. This is why you're likely to communicate with them relatively well. You're likely to tell them in phases. You're likely not escalate to things like, oh my God, you're just being needy. You're going to first talk about why this could potentially need to lead to needy tendencies, and they probably should look out for things like this. We think that we create better space for greater discussion, and that's obviously a good thing. First argument then, directly clashing with government. Why is excessive neediness bad for a relationship? First thing I want to respond, which directly clashes with Matt, is just why do people have natural tendencies to be excessively needy? Three reasons why this is true. First, humans often struggle with emotional regulation. It is often very easy to over rely on your partner, and it is often very easy to think that they should be there for all the problems you have. This is because humans don't have a lot of other experiences doing that. They know that they can't really do that with their friends because there are often natural barriers, but immediately they have ascribed some sort of relationship with their partners that they feel like this is the one source of emotional support that they have, and therefore over-ascribe to these people and over-ascribe in the affection they give for them. Secondly, relationship provides validation, which can become very addictive. So even if it's not the case that they're overly selfish, that they care about their partner, it is so addicting because the feeling of physical validation makes you feel so good that you often don't check yourself when you overdo it. Thirdly, Matt says even if you're selfish, you care about those people. But obviously, your selfishness often overrides the level of care you have for these people because it just feels so good when you're able to trauma dump to them, when you're able to ask them for validation, when you want them to satisfy your needs and your wants. So, between caring about them and your own desires, where these are often very proximate, you're likely to care about your desires, you're likely to be very bad at regulating when it is the time that you're being overly emotionally reliant. This stigma is necessary then, because when unchecked, needy individuals start treating probably their partners as therapists. And this probably builds resentment and creates really unequal emotional burdens. Relationships can become very overwhelming and often exhausting because it's difficult for people who already have a lot to go on and a lot going on in their lives to also take care of every other detail in every other people's life. By the way, this is not even getting to the point of harassment. We're just talking about even if this is in the most likely manifestation, it's still likely bad for relationship. In most instances, this leads to codependency. So Matt says that it's fine because at least you're codependent with people that you're most likely compatible with. But obviously, the comparative is a world where you're just not that codependent of a person to start with, which is significantly better because it's harder to find a person that you're always going to be compatible. It is hard to find a person who will always take your trauma dumping in a good way. It is difficult to ask some other person in the world to take all of that stuff from you. But it's often easier if you're just independent to start with because it's often more sustainable irrespective of who you end up with. You're likely to be a better person to start with when you recognize that neediness is something that's bad. We think that this exhaustion is often bad because it reduces the aggregate amount of happiness you often get from engaging with a relationship. Resentment is really bad because these little tallies of emotions are often things that triggers an argument and conflict eruption down the line. Codependence is really bad because you often ditch your friends and you talk to your friends less when you become so needy and attached to one person instead of multiple people, and the breakup becomes even more devastating in the long run. So even in the normal or in the most like majority of instances where this isn't the extreme, obviously this is really, really bad for the relationship. And the stigma uniquely solves for this problem exactly because we concede that the stigma is harsh, as government also concedes. But secondly, why is this likely to lead to harassment? And that's really, really bad. We think people cannot often handle rejection or constantly seek validation are the people who spam text despite no responses. They are the people who are likely to overwhelm their potential partners with excessive affection, despite these are things that often make other people uncomfortable. There are probably other norms that try to stop this, but it's really difficult for these people to it's very easy for these people to rationalize their behaviors because there's often optimism that bias that they believe that these are things that are acceptable in the long run. The stigma obviously create a much stronger deterrent because you feel ashamed of engaging in these behaviors in the first place. You think for a second, should I do this? And this is often really, really good. Lastly, I just want to talk about why this actually makes emotional claims more visible. But before that, I want to weigh the first argument. Obviously, the external balancing forces that Matt talks about doesn't really work because it's very easy for these people to like basically rationalize their behaviors. It's very hard for external actors to say, "Oh, you're being needy," absent this stigma, because often a lot of these people think that neediness or no whatnot happens behind closed door, behind your close relationship. So these are not things that other people can comment on, and so it's very easy for people to abuse this and do this a lot. Why it's likely that this makes emotional claims actually more visible? So Matt's argument is that this is bad because people shut up about their problems and don't talk about them more. We actually think that the normalization of this means that there's less discussion about what's even neediness to start with. I think that a space that promotes more discussion and a space that actually correctly labels this as something that's wrong or not actually encourages people to talk about this more, leading this to be better expanded by my deputy.
All right, hi everyone. This is the training portion of this session. So I will start with our reasoning for placing neediness in round five, and then I'll go into some broader strategic notes on the motion and possible CGs, and then Belle can talk a bit more about possible CO extensions given the debate that happened. So in terms of placement, general guidance for round five motions are that they should be one of the most balanced and deep motions you have in your set, but they should also be reasonably accessible. Round five is many teams' last chance to break, and you want to ensure that the best debaters break. So you want a motion that gives teams in any position the best shot of demonstrating their skills, even if they say get unlucky and draw CG. And based on our test, we felt that there was a lot of available material on the motion and that the motion didn't impose any unequal burdens on teams. Similarly, it should be accessible to everyone so that teams with specific knowledge don't arbitrarily benefit in the most crucial round of the tournament. And we felt that this stigma was something that everyone could relate to. Everyone has seen these reels on social media, on Instagram and on TikTok. So we felt it was a pretty accessible motion. Secondly, we also chose to put a spec error motion in round four because we wanted to make sure that after teams got sorted, teams still had some advantage over other teams for knowing more about Africa, for example. So to offset the fact that we put a reasonably hard motion in round four, we also wanted a softer motion in round five to ensure that different skills were being tested. Round four obviously is a harder motion, but also is more, can you weigh different stakeholders in very different areas of the debate? Whereas round five on neediness is focusing a bit more on your ability to mechanize very precisely and in a more subtle way. So in terms of skills that this motion is testing, like I mentioned, you have to be very precise about norms. Something or another may happen anyway. Harassment may happen anyway. Codependence may happen anyway. So teams have to be very specific about how this stigma in particular changes those behaviors at the margins. It's also a motion that very heavily tests your ability to characterize well. One important takeaway that I hope people have after this demo debate is in debates like these, there's a tendency for debaters to say this stigma or this norm will be communicated in good ways or bad ways without any further explanation of what it being communicated in a good or bad way looks like. So one important skill that we're testing with this motion is, can you be specific about what the stigma being bad looks like? So to use an example from my speech, when I'm talking about what it means for the stigma to be harsh, I'm specific about it being that you define excessive in a very broad way. So it's going to apply to a large number of situations, and therefore a significant number of people feel self-conscious about communicating their concerns. Um, so yeah, does anyone else have anything to add? I know that others had some thoughts about possible weighing strategies on this motion. Bell or Pranav?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the motion also naturally probably involves a fair bit of weighing in two areas. So firstly, which is weighing between competing mechanisms. So often you may have noticed that like both teams are sometimes going for like either opposite or I guess in some ways the same impact, but accessing it the opposite ways. So like, this is what improves communication, this is what worsens it. And so usually it really helps to like try and figure out ways to detail the precise ways as to how your side or your mechanism is a better or likelier or more impactful mechanism in some way than the other, instead of just being like very generally sort of saying their case or their mechanism is wrong and sort of giving like three other different new reasons. It just makes the debate a lot messier, and especially in rounds where like, like both sides are somewhat intuitive, that kind of charitability is needed. The other way weighing is pretty important is like weighing between different types of arguments over here, or I should say maybe some kinds of different like maybe some sense of different impacts. But in this debate, it's especially important. So, for example, I would recommend finding metrics you want to make comparisons on. So, for example, if you're a team who like thinks about the situationships argument, why might you want to weigh this sort of situation above others? Or if you, for example, are talking about relationships at the start, like in the dating phase versus relationships like that have been developed for long periods of time. Another thing you can probably think of is like yeah, like instances where, for example, like a person who is deeply going to like buy into this norm versus someone who is anyways going to be withdrawn or not entirely interact with it. So I think what's really important is to like figure out a very clear like metric or situation in which you can be distinct, and then find ways to weigh that. Especially important for extensions, but I also think on top-offs, it's really easy to be very general. It's far more important to have like some specific thing that a judge or somebody can grab a hold on to understand your case.
Great. So I will get into possible CG case lines that you could run after the PM that I gave. So there are three broad extension ideas. The first is on self-improvement and how the stigma against neediness hampers that. And there are two broad angles that you can use for this argument. The first is people who mistreat others can use the stigma against neediness to justify that mistreatment. Because the stigma also gives the person who's like calling another person needy a sense of moral authority. They're needy for you. So what you can say is, on our side, without this stigma, you can't write someone off as being too needy when they try to express their issues with you. You need to hear them out. And importantly, if you use any alternative justification for doing something like ghosting, it has to be more specific to their behavior. So when their behavior is actually bad and it merits you ghosting them, you could still do it. But the difference is people don't use perceived neediness as a reason to ghost people who are otherwise well-meaning. The other way that you can run this argument is to just say the stigma specifically discourages self-reflection on why you are needy and what it is that you are seeking from others that you don't have. What emotional insecurity do you have that you are trying to seek out in others by asking them for their validation? And why does the stigma discourage that? It creates a significant amount of guilt. So you don't want to think about it. You don't want to be judged by others. So you don't bring it up to your friends to the same extent. Whereas when it's not stigmatized, you might actually be more willing to talk to people around you about why you are seeking that validation in the first place, allowing you to resolve any underlying emotional issues that you might have. And this can easily be weighed as more important than other issues in the round. One thing you might say is when individuals self-improve and reflect on the issues that they have to a greater extent and realize that they are actually mistreating others or that they do have a specific emotional insecurity that they need to resolve, that means that when they do enter relationships, they will also treat their partners better to a more significant extent. And that's one of the biggest determinants of whether you can be a good partner for someone in the first place. Are you emotionally mature to recognize when you yourself are also wrong? Another possible extension that you could run on CG is actually that the stigma against neediness increases the amount of cheating in relationships. And this is basically built-in depth on the motion because the cheating argument requires many different burdens to be met for the argument to work, even though it's also a pretty realistic argument. The way the claim goes is like this. The stigma against neediness very strongly encourages people to repress their emotional needs, but you still want those emotional needs, right? So here's the difference. When it's stigmatized and you're not supposed to talk to your partner about it, you may be more likely to try to seek out those needs elsewhere. And you specifically will try to cheat because there are things that friends or family can't give you, like, for example, a sexual relationship. So, given that the stigma encourages that repression, you're more likely to cheat to have those needs fulfilled. Whereas, when neediness isn't stigmatized, you might preemptively communicate your concerns with your partner more. You don't like repress your needs to the same extent, and therefore the need for you to cheat is reduced. Finally, there is a lot of extension material on how this creates situationships. I hinted at this very briefly in my PM, but there's a very strong argument that the stigma against neediness is one of the primary causes of many, especially younger people, entering many more situationships. And this is its own debate with many different arguments on either side of the debate. So even if opening government, for example, runs one or two reasons why situationships are bad, there are still five reasons available to closing government that they could weigh as being more important than OG. So, for example, people may be more likely to hide relationships that they're or situationships that they're in from their friends, and why that might be bad. That situationships often involve power imbalances in those types of interactions where like one person is more desired than another, and how that can be really bad for individuals' mental health. And then you can weigh why these types of relationships are the most important, or where the debate has the largest margin relative to other arguments about, for example, being in the early stages of actually dating someone. So those are three possible ideas on CG. Belle, do you want to talk a bit more about CO?
Yeah, sure. So I think after my speech, there's also like about three areas of kind of extensions I would think about. Uh, Actually, I think one of them is a little bit of horizontal extension. The other I would describe as just more depth and explaining kind of periods and phases of relationship that I don't think in my speech was like nuanced enough to address, right? So I would say that in my speech, there was just blanket reasons as to why in relationship this makes people worse or this makes people better. I think that there's a lot of depth on, for example, first of all, why this stigma is good for relationship forming. So that's not like in general why it's good or bad for relationship, but just at the beginning or the very early onset of your relationship, why this is good for formation or bad for formation. So obviously we would say that this is good for formation. I think that there's argument on why, for example, people rush into relationships too soon naturally and their natural tendencies to do that. And when this stigma exists, it means that you're likely to open up less or you're likely to wait longer. That's actually a good thing because it means that you can gauge things like compatibility. You take things more slowly. You don't open up as much as quickly. You don't try to be needy as early as you would otherwise, which actually gives you time to figure out whether this person is actually compatible with you and whether you want that relationship in the first place. The second area, which is a lot of depth in terms of the phases of relationship, is where you can also talk about your dynamics in the long run, right? So again, instead of talking about how this interacts with the person, your partner in general, you can talk about how, for example, after you're in a relatively stable relationship and that you're pretty sure that this person loves you quite a lot, you love this person quite a lot. Why is it still good that there's this stigma that exists? Because, for example, it encourages you to become more independent. It encourages you to improve. It encourages you to become more confident. It actually improves your dynamics over time because it's actually very exciting to watch your partner be more independent, be more confident, and succeed in some ways that don't rely on you and it isn't relevant to you. So these are all ways that I think can I wouldn't describe as vertical depth, but just like being more nuanced about like different phases of relationship and where you are in the relationship already open up a lot of doors for like specific arguments as to how like this stigma or the idea of neediness kind of operates slightly differently and improves your relationship in better ways. And then I think the third area that I think like that was missed in my speech is an argument that probably requires very like precise application of how this like stigma actively works. But I think it's very interesting, which is just the flip of guff as to why you're actually more likely to talk about neediness in a good way or have positive discourse or identify mistreatment better on our side. The way this argument would ideally would probably work is the first you need to explain why this stick or the normalization on guff's side actually means that you reduce the type of discussion you want and you make it harder for people to identify when you're being emotionally over reliant or when you're not being emotionally reliant at all. Because presumably in a world where this is normalized, people just like try to, in Gov's best case, try to be as needy as possible or like really loving to each other or like be emotionally reliant on each other. And then if you're told that like there's something that's wrong or you're prescribed as needy, it is actually very hard for you to identify or have those discussions about when you're actually being mistreated or you're not really your emotional needs are not being satisfied, which means that interestingly a stigma actually encourages you to think about that more because then you actually get into discussion of if you are entering the territory of being needy and that's actually actively being stigmatized. Maybe it is not the case that you're needy. Maybe it is the case that your partner is not fulfilling your emotional needs and you were just not able to see that in the first place. So I think it's a very interesting argument that requires you to walk through all those steps as to why these people are more likely to identify, for example, that it is not the case that they're being unreasonable, but it is actually the case that their emotional needs are not being fulfilled, and probably they need to voice those concerns in a relationship in the first place. And this stigma actually encourages the drawing of that boundary, and that's really good. So that's like kind of like a flip on Gov that I think is very interesting that I don't think I got to in my speech as well. Yeah.
Great. Thanks everyone for watching and see you in the next session.